Hey, this is Mr. Mitchell with another video. Today we're going to talk about genetics and heredity. Go ahead and write down these questions and we will get started. Genetics. There was a European priest named Gregor Mendel, and that's kind of a depiction of him right there. His experiments, the experiments he had in his monastery, would revolutionize the study of heredity. That's the passing of physical characteristics from parents to offspring. Genetics, here's genetics right up here. Genetics is the scientific study of heredity. Well, anyway, Mendel wondered why these different pea plants had different characteristics. Why some of them were tall and some of them were short and some of them had round peas and some of them didn't have round peas. And he ended up conducting experiments. Uh, each form of characteristic, like height or seed color or whether it's round or not, is called a trait, and that's what that is. So that's each form of characteristic. So Mendel experimented with thousands of pea plants. Now, a new organism forms, well, like pea plants, when egg and sperm join in the process called fertilization. In these pea plants, the stamens, which is right here, you can see on this video, produce the pollen, which is the sperm, and the pistils, which is right here, produce the egg. Now, typically pea plants are self-pollinating. They don't need another plant to reproduce. But what Mendel did was cross-pollinate. You can see the term cross-pollination here. He would take the pollen from one plant and brush it on the other plant. So that kind of forced one plant to have the male characteristics and one plant to have the female characteristics, and that ended up uh, being kind of how he could get started on this experiment. And what he would do, he would start on experiments with purebred plants, and you can see this purebred right here. Purebred is where you have generations that have the same trait. For example, short pea plants who came from other short pea plants, who came from other short pea plants, they all had the same trait in successive generations. So you didn't see variances in purebred plants. So he would always start out with these purebred plants. And what he would then do is cross-pollinate with contrasting traits. So he would take that tall plant or that short plant and cross-pollinate with a tall plant. This one might be short, this one might be tall. So he could see whether the offspring would be short or whether the offspring would be tall. So he called the pea generation the parent plants, and the F generation, or filial generation, F-I-L-I-A-L, was the offspring. Now, in all of Mendel's crosses, only one form of the trait appeared in the first filial generation. So keep in mind, he's crossbreeding short plants, for example, with tall plants. And whenever he crossbred the short plants with the tall plants, he always came up with the tall plants in that first generation. But then in the second generation, 1/4 of them would be short. So that trait here would show up, but it wouldn't show up at first. So he thought that was kind of interesting that the tall and the short plants didn't just have a medium-sized plant. It would either be tall, all tall, or every once in a while short. So he kept experimenting. He ended up calling that F2 generation, where you finally had the short plants showing up, the lost generation, I guess you might say. The gene that controls the stem height has one allele. Allele is a term in this section. Has one allele. That is different forms of a gene. Different forms of a gene are called alleles. So one allele would be tall stems and one allele would be short stems. And you have an example right here. Tall would be represented by a capital T, and short would be represented by a small t. Capital letters are the dominant alleles, and the smaller lowercase letters are the recessive. The dominant and recessive, lowercase recessive, higher case dominant. So when you ended up having an offspring that was like this, that had one dominant and one recessive, it showed up as tall because the dominant alleles hide, I guess you might say, the recessive alleles. The recessive is hidden when the dominant allele is present. So even though this offspring right here was tall, it had inside it that recessive gene. So for every pea plant, there were many traits that could be either dominant or recessive, not just stem height. I mean, it could have been the color, it could have been the shape of the pods, it could have been the shape of the peas. There are trillions, perhaps, of different traits that could be either dominant or recessive. And that goes for all organisms. So let's get to some, here are some examples of the different dominant and recessive here. Let's see what a hybrid is. All the first generation plants were called hybrids. In other words, all the ones that had a capital letter and a small letter were called hybrids because they were not purebred. Purebred is kind of the opposite of hybrid. Purebred, all short, all short, all short. Hybrid is a combination of short and tall, just using that example. Let's see. Gregor Mendel's experiments proved that parent traits simply do not just blend in their offspring. And as a result, Gregor Mendel was called the father of genetics. Now we're going to go into the second section of our particular book and talk about Punnett squares. A Punnett square, now we have two examples of Punnett squares here. We have the one here with the mice, and we have the one here with the tall and short. A Punnett square is a chart that shows all possible combinations of alleles that can result from a genetic cross. So here are some examples. We have the male allele, and what are the male? Let's see, I'll erase a little bit more here. Sorry about that. But we end up having the male parent alleles are on top of the Punnett square, and along the side of the Punnett square you have the female alleles. So in this case we have both a male and a female that are tall, using T, but they both carry the short gene. So look at the offspring. You have one with a tall, that would be a purebred. You have one that looks like it's tall, and it is tall, but it also carries the small t, which means that that recessive does not show up, and you have another one here. But look at this one right here. This does not have the tall gene here, so that means that you would have 1/4 that would end up showing up that would be short, even though the parents and grandparents were tall. And that happens all the time with human beings, just somebody turns out to have a different trait somewhere along the line. Now take a look over here. Here we have purebred. So this is hybrid right here, and purebred, I'll go right through Mendel over there, is right here. The purebred, notice we have the older generation, we have a white mouse and we have a black mouse. Now what's happening here is the black fur color is apparently dominant because you have the capital B here. You have capital B and capital B. So whenever you have a purebred white mouse, then that means you have BB with a capital B, BB with a capital B. You have BBs all over the place. And what that means is that all of them carry that gene that has the white hair on it, but the recessive gene is not going to show up whenever it's paired with the dominant gene. And that's exactly what's going to happen right there. So I'm kind of looking at my notes and just seeing that I have everything here. We have the allele that each parent passes along to its offspring is based on probability. Now, probability is kind of like flipping a coin. Sure, the odds are that it would be 50-50, that it would be heads or tails. But if you were to actually flip it 100 times, sure, it may be 47 heads, or it may be 52 heads, or it's just probable that all these mice here, for example, would be black-haired. Not absolutely certain. It's just probability. Male parent alleles, like I said, are on the top of the Punnett square. Female parent alleles are on the side of the square. Have a term called a phenotype. A phenotype is the visible traits. Phenotype here is black fur. Phenotype here is tall plant. See, they're the physical appearance, whereas the genotype is just the allele combinations. The B, capital B and small b is an allele combination. It's a genotype. Small t and small t is a genotype. So we end up discussing the same things because you can have, for example, small t and small t has the phenotype of a short plant, but the genotype of a little t, little t. And like I said before, the dominant allele masks a recessive allele. Like in here, this would be a plant that was tall, even though it has that short gene, I guess you might say, in there. An organism that has two identical alleles is homozygous. So when you have the BB or the TT here, they are homozygous. And in fact, I guess I should go up here with it. The two capital letters or the two small letters would be homozygous. But heterozygous is where you have different ones. Heterozygous would be where you have a capital T, for example, and a small t, for example. Now, there's one other thing I want to talk about, and that is codominance. Sometimes you have a Punnett square where one characteristic doesn't dominate the other characteristic. And here's an example. You have this white chicken and this black chicken. Their feathers, the white feathers and the black feathers in chickens, apparently are not dominant. They're codominant, which means you're going to have white and black show up in every single one of these offspring. And you'll end up sometimes with flowers that have like different colors whenever that's the case, whenever you have codominance. And as far as the genotypes goes, here's what it looks like. You have the dominant R and the dominant W, whatever R and W might stand for. You put them together, and it's kind of like multiplying things together is how these Punnett squares end up being. So you notice that all four end up being the same thing, and in a codominant situation, codominance right here, you would have truly the complete mix-up between the two. Here you would have that blend. Hey, don't forget to finish the questions. Hope you learned a little bit.